Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar in the Chef Masterclass series. The topic for today's webinar is using Chef Agentless to manage Cisco networking devices. If you can see the screen and if you can hear my voice clearly, please confirm through the chat panel and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Don Slanik. I'm a sales engineer or solution architect, whatever you want to call it, here at Progress Chef. And today I want to talk to you, I'm going to be talking to you about a new functionality and feature of the Chef agent known as Agentless. So I know that kind of sounds weird, like an agent doing agentless, but as we go through, that should make a little bit more sense, and hopefully we can all see the value of it. So as I go through, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to put them into the chat box. And then if we'll get to them at the end, or if we don't get to them at the end, we can absolutely follow up after the fact via email as well. So perfect. So today we're going to go over what is Chef Agentless. We'll go over some example use cases of where this might apply, where it might fit. We'll take a look at a demo and a very specific use case in terms of network appliance configuration, and specifically looking at Cisco devices. So although the approaches and techniques that we'll look at here can apply to other vendors as well, depending on implementations and things like that. So perfect. So as we get started, if you're familiar with Chef, and specifically the Chef client, you know that there's a lot of very cool benefits and features that it provides. So some of the big things are the ease of configuration. So being able to have cookbooks, policies, recipes that all define how my system should be set up, how they should be configured, and ultimately continue to check and make sure that they're configured that way and correct them correct them when needed. It also provides a lot of benefit around compliance and checking to see are systems secure, are they configured in that state that they should be? If they're not, when did it fall out of compliance there? And then ultimately, automating all this and making it so that way it runs repeatedly in the background so we don't have to worry about it, and then reporting those results to you. But up until recently, there was a decent chunk of infrastructure that was left out of this, right? And that was anything that really couldn't have an agent installed in it, right? So as you know, Chef Client is an agent that you put on the system and it runs all the automations locally. But if you weren't able to put an agent in, you were kind of out of luck. And so what we were seeing in terms of where this fit was a lot of IoT and network type edge cases and use cases, right? So things like routers and switches, firewalls, IP telephony, like IDS, IPS, and virtualization and things like that were not able to have agents installed, mainly because they were maybe a different type of OS or different type of interface. Some of them are vendor lockdown. So, maybe it's a vendor appliance that you install within your network and you don't have access to actually go on and change things and install things. Or if you do, you might lose support, right? So we're seeing a lot of that. And so ultimately what we came out with was, Chef Agentless. And so again, having to manage all those devices manually provided a lot of challenges that couldn't necessarily be solved up until now. So, in terms of things like manually intervention, so if a configuration has to be made, it has to be done manually by someone who has the knowledge of that appliance. High troubleshooting costs. So a lot of times it was left up to shell scripts or bash scripts or PowerShell scripts, and if the person who wrote that hasn't used it in a while, or maybe they even left the company, now you have to have a script that has to be run that no one knows how it works, and so you spend time trying to figure out how it works, if there's any issues, trying to troubleshoot it and figure out what exactly went wrong. And then one of the big things was lack of security and visibility, right? So if I'm running shell scripts and things because I can't manage it through Chef, I might have passwords and tokens in there in plain text available to anyone who has access to that shell. And then when I run it, I might not get full results back, right? So those are the things that we're seeing, and that's why we introduced Agentless. And so what Agentless allows you to do is to configure those types of devices without putting an agent on them. So we still leverage the chef agent, and you'll see how we do that in a sec here. But essentially, the chef agent can reach out to remote devices and remote systems and manage them for you. So it does leverage all the recipes, cookbooks, and policies just like your normal chef client does. So if you've got automations and things that are already built that you want to try to port over, it's really easy because it just runs the exact same code. There's nothing there, but it also Agentless adds some customizations and things that you can add on top of that. And now one of the big things is this doesn't replace the agent for Chef, but it is a nice complement to it. So for your traditional server type systems or your client type systems, you'll still want to run Chef Client just because it's it doesn't have the it has a less of an overhead and things like that, and a lot of times that pattern's already working, so you don't need to mess with it. But this adds on top of that, so it covers those systems that can't be covered like that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is going to help eliminate, manual script running. If there's multiple automation tools in play, like this can help consolidate all that, so everything can be under the same roof, the same base of knowledge, and managed in the same way. So from an architectural perspective, this is what it looks like. So normally in Chef, you'd have a Chef management server that then the agents on the systems would talk to. In this case, it's actually the agent just talking directly to these other systems, right? So in this diagram, you'll see it labeled as Chef Workstation. So Chef Workstation can do all of this and perform these actions, but you can also just run Chef Client on a Bastion host or like a utility server and have that do all this as well. It works the exact same way. So again, those routers, firewalls, switches, all those will not have anything agent on them. They'll just be as they are. And then that workstation or that Bastion host is going to connect to those and talk to them directly. So we've covered some of the benefits already. So, the big one is going to be that extended coverage. So covering devices that typically either couldn't be managed automatically or were very difficult and tedious to cover manually. Eliminating those scripts and the repeatability as well. And then ultimately, the goal of this was to make things more secure, more flexible, repeatable, and reliable. So a lot of times these actions that we automate have to be done every so often, or they're updated every so often. And so the goal is to make it so that way, when that does occur, it's either ready to go to run automatically, or if you need to adjust and tweak things, it's all in a standard format that you already know. So it's, it's very easy to do versus trying to understand what was going on, what changes we made last time, and then updating to that. So today we've got a kind of a live scenario that we'll run through. And then again, this is going to focus on those Cisco devices. But just to tee it up really quick, in this particular case, it's Thursday afternoon. John and his network team received a list of changes that had to occur and made across the network as soon as possible. Of course, this happens late at night or late in the afternoon, so time is short. But the important thing was this has to happen across all the branch offices located across 15 different countries. So, if we're talking about one office, maybe, you can do that one ad hoc and that's easy, but we're talking 15. So having to do this across multiple devices in an office, across 15 different offices, all geographically dispersed, that's when you get a lot of that complexity in that, and all that. So before, before Agentless was around, it was all manually, right? So as you can see on the left side, like we had to determine what all those steps that we had to perform were. If we had existing scripts or automations, we had to understand what they were doing, how they were built. We had to log into each of those systems individually and then make those changes on those systems. And, as we all know, no one's perfect, right? So logging in manually and then typing in commands manually has a high chance of fat fingering something or typing something in error, right? And then on top of that, we would have to track all this manually if, when we completed those steps or, what systems we've already touched versus what we need to touch, right? So now not only have I run those commands manually, and maybe, I accidentally screwed one up on a system somewhere, and now, that system doesn't match the others, but also I have to keep track of which ones I've touched. And if I verify on which ones I verified, and then all this is not really reusable, right? So as we go through the next time, I'm gonna have to go through this process all over again, in addition to adding changes and lessons learned and things like that. So the difference with Agentless is we can already start with a common cookbook. So as you know, with Chef, cookbooks can have attributes and they can have parameters. So I can have a single cookbook that gets deployed against all those, and I can use attributes to customize anything that needs to be customized for a particular system, or attribute it if I need to fill in like a version number or something later on. So once, I've got my cookbook, I create a list of what I want to update. So that could be like a list of IPs, it could be a list of the systems. And then I just run, I tell Chef Client to run agentless mode and connect to those systems, run the cookbooks, and then I can watch in real time as those things as they pass or they fail. And so if they do all pass, I've got an audit list that I can go through and say, hey, these are all the systems I've changed. But more importantly, if that system fails, I get feedback right away and I can go and troubleshoot that, right? And then because it is a cookbook, you get to reuse it again for next time, right? So, as we go through that process, maybe there's some lessons learned, maybe, we added another command or another configuration to the stuff we want to change. I can really quickly add it to the cookbook. It's version controlled, so I can, manage that and see the history of it. And then the cycle just repeats itself. So, again, very kind of easy to manage and very seamless. So perfect. So yeah, we'll switch gears here. That's all the slides I have for today. So we can go ahead and dig into the demo here. So in this particular case, I've got a Cisco switch that we're talking to. And so I actually have a cookbook built to configure that particular Cisco switch. So in this particular case, what I've got are 3 configurations that I'm making on that system, right? So one is I'm changing the message of the day on it. So when I log in, what's that banner that I see? And then these 2 are actually 2 interfaces on that particular switch. So right now that switch is all it is powered on, and that's it. It hasn't been configured, the ports haven't been enabled. And so what these are going to do is actually go in and enable these 2 ports and configure them. So in this particular case, I'm going to be configuring gigabit Ethernet 1010 and 1011. And so again, normally when I would actually go and do this on a system, right, I would log in and I go into, I do enable, I go into configuration terminal, and then I would be configuring these command by command, right? So I would have to configure, the line speed and delays and everything like that, and then save that config. This is going to do that automatically. And so the cool thing about this too is, as I mentioned, because it's using cookbooks and recipes, you also get attributes with it as well. So if I've got a lot, I might have a switch where I'm configuring 10 ports or 20 ports, and I might be doing that across multiple switches, across multiple offices. I have this full list of attributes here. And so in this case, I'm setting the attributes for each of these ports here. But I can have it where I have a default config unless something shows up as an attribute, and then the attribute can override it. So what I can do is I can say, hey, by default, all my ports are disabled. But if I have an attribute set up for that particular interface, enable that port and do these settings. So, so what this is going to actually do is take all these settings, convert it to that Cisco iOS configuration command, and then run it on that system. And you can even see too, you can disable settings and disable things by just adding no to the front of it, right? So in this case, I've got no here, so I'm not actually setting this particular thing. So, so if if I do a configuration here and I want to maybe go back later and disable this port, I can just add no to these, and then it'll disable that as if it weren't on at all, right? So perfect. So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to go into the switch itself. So I'll just log in. Make this a little bigger. Perfect. And then actually, that one. So we'll take a look at the configuration really quick here. You can see when I logged in, I didn't have a banner, message of the day, anything like that. And if we scroll down through here, I can see all those different interfaces are, disabled. They're not running anything. They're not open. They're just closed, right? So up there. So perfect. So now for a target mode or agentless mode, all we're going to do is we're going to use that chef client. We're going to run it and we're going to point it to that particular device or that particular endpoint that we want to touch. And we'll tell it what cookbook we want to run. So this is actually what that command looks like. So I'm just running chef client. I've got -Z. This is going to tell it, hey, I'm not running chef client on a locally. I'm going to run it against a remote system. I have my cookbook or my recipe that I'm running. In this case, it's called TMT, but this could be anything. And just like chef client, like traditional, where you might have a cookbook that calls multiple other cookbooks or it's dependent on other cookbooks, that also works here as well. So I might have other, this TMT could have dependencies or other cookbooks that it pulls functionality from, works the exact same way. So, and then ultimately, we have what device we want to hit. So in this case, I got a line item in my credential file called Cisco switch. And all that credential file is, it's just a list of, systems that you want to run against. And then here I just have the host name. So in my case, I put the IP and then username, password. You can put username, key. And so that's actually going to give it the credentials to touch the system. So in this environment, it's local on my system, but that could be in a password vault. It could be, or in a secure vault. It could be, something like that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run it. And so this will take a sec, but it's going to go through the normal run here. We'll get some warnings, but yep. And you can see here it's telling me it was reading from that credentials file. It's pulling it's getting the cookbook. Again, in my case, my cookbook's stored locally, but it could be stored in your Chef Infra server, or it could be in a repository or wherever. And now here's the actual, where we actually run the, we're actually running and touching that system, right? So we connect into it. In my particular case, I'm not running any inspect profiles, but this is also something that you could do as well. So inspect is also able to run remotely. And so you could run compliance scans and things like that as well. So that's where these are coming into play. But yeah, so here, here we're seeing actually what we're doing. So in my case, I'm setting the message of the day. So you can see the actual message here is going to be configured via Chef Recipe 1, and it was blank, so it wasn't configured. And then here's the actual, those two interfaces that I configured on that switch, right? So you can see, it was blank. And so now we put, we have a description, we've got the delay, we've got our line speed, everything like that. So both of those. And now as part of updating this, it's also, written that config to memory and, and is actually applied. So if I go back here, go back and log into that switch. you can see I get my message of the day. Now I got my interfaces configured here. And then it's configured, you know, set up and configured the way that I want it. So now, if we were to get an error message, you know, these would be red, and then I would get the actual error message and like a error trace of it. But you know, these are all successful, right? So everything's good. So this is, you know, very easy. You get those results right away, and those results should be easy to troubleshoot and figure out. Now, one of the benefits of this versus kind of manually scripting and manually trying to automate things is you have the power of idempotence for this as well. So what that is, you know, as I check that system, you know, in my case, I want to say, hey, my message of the day is configured via Chef Recipe 1. If that's already set, don't mess with it. Like it's, you know, it's good. You don't have to change anything, right? So a lot of those manual systems won't check for that, or it's extremely hard to check for that. And so what they'll do is, you know, if my script failed, maybe I run that script over and over again, expecting it to trigger, you know, configure everything correctly, but, you know, it might still mess up that one or two things that failed. Where this will tell you it could fail, but also I don't have to worry about that because I'm getting the yes, it passed, or, you know, yes, it's changed, or hey, no, it was currently already in the right setting, so don't worry about that. So to kind of prove that and to look at what that looks like, I'm going to actually go ahead and run this again. Again, my switch is in a good state, so you know, it shouldn't, none of those should actually change, but we'll go through that. Perfect. So yeah, so here you can see, here's where we ran those 3 resources. And again, everything is up to date. So, you know, my message of the day is set the right way that it should be, up to date, up to date. So again, that's, you know, it's not going to change. So not only is this good for like ad hoc jobs, kind of like what we're doing now, you could also use this to, you know, hit those systems continuously, but like you would as a normal chef agent local, to check and, you know, configure things the way you'd want. So I could have my full switch config in Chef and have that switch be hit every day, every, you know, twice a day, or even if I wanted every 5 minutes, and verify that nothing's changed on that switch, right? And if it does change it back to what it should be. Earlier I mentioned attributes and being able to use those, you know, the power of attributes in there. We can go ahead and actually put that into practice, right? So in my first interface here, I can see, you know, I've got a gigabit interface, but I've got the line speed set to 100 megabits, right? So what I can do is I'll just add a 0 here, rerun it. And then as that goes through, it's going to say, hey, you know, I saw a change there. It was 100, you know, it was 100, but I updated it to 1,000. So it's not going to touch those other 2 things because I haven't touched those and I haven't changed those. But here you can see what the new value is. And then what the, so if I go highlight it here, so this is all the new value. And then here's the old value, right? So here's, you know, here's what it was. So there's where that speed to 1,000 is. So the cool thing about this as well is with a lot of the manual processes and techniques, you're not looking at what the old value was. You know, you might have a control logic where you're looking for a value and you're changing it, but you're not usually reporting on what that value was. Where Chef, out of the box, it's going to do that. So maybe, you know, maybe if I want to go through and say, okay, yeah, I made a change, that's great, but what was it? You're going to get the full output of that. So you'll always have that, and you can see, you know, really quickly, okay, it wasn't, you know, in this case, it was 100, now it's 1,000, you know, it's configured correctly kind of thing. So, So yeah, so that really in a nutshell is it. So like I said, Agentless is designed really to extend where you can use those chef tools and methodologies, and extend it into those systems that are locked down or don't have an agent and all that. So the way it's deployed, like in this case for Cisco, but also a lot of the other ones, is the chef resources that you're already familiar with and you're using. Those are getting updated with agentless functionality in them. So a good example is we have a resource for REST APIs. And so that was updated to run remotely in agentless mode, so against a different system. And so we're actually building those out and updating those constantly. So essentially, when you're going to manage one of those systems, you can use those resources, and just like you would develop a cookbook for a local run, the difference just will be when you run it, pointing it at that remote system IP or that host name, and and going. So, but yeah, so that's agentless mode. And again, this could go as long as you can interface with that system in terms of like an API or SSH or like WinRM or some type of remote protocol like that. You should be able to manage and configure it. So, and again, this can run air gapped as well. So in my case, I'm running this locally off my laptop. As long as I've got network connectivity to that switch, I don't need internet connectivity. I can run, and configure it directly. So if you do have air gapped environments, you can do things like download all your recipes, all your cookbooks, store them locally, and then run them locally with agentless mode. And then that way, you can be completely air gapped, but you still configure those systems that you need to configure. So. Perfect. So yeah, so now we've done a little early, but what I'd like to do is open it up to if you have any questions. We can go through those really quick here. And before I go through that, you'll after you leave, you should get a survey. Please, if you can, fill it in. It helps us just dial in the content, gives us an idea kind of what was good, what could be improved on. And ultimately make these sessions more useful in the future for you. So, so yeah, let's take a look. Perfect. So we got a question. Yep. So what needs to be in the credentials file for the connection, and can this work with WinRM on Windows to run a recipe that's not part of an existing policy? Great question. So, yep. So I can actually share that credentials file here. Give you an idea of kind of what one looks like. So here's what an example of one looks like. So in this case, for the Cisco switch, I am using username and password authentication. So you can see, I got my IP here and that. And so that's where that -T switch comes into place. So essentially, oops. When I'm doing this -T, it's going to go into that credentials file and find that, the matching name, right? And so this is kind of you get the benefit of, yeah, I can connect into, I can use those credentials, but also I'm not putting those credentials in like the command line, and so it's not going into my history. But yeah, so here's what that looks like for that type of authentication. I've got some other ones here that are using key-based authentication, but that's what that credentials file looks like. But if you have like a secure vault, like a HashiCorp vault or a key list or any of those other ones, that could be that could be used as well. Perfect. Yeah, so, okay, so this question, would this run directly from the Chef Infra or Chef Automate server, or does it need a separate server to run from? So it could, the answer to that is yes and no, it can. So as long as you can run a Chef client, it can run agentless mode. So Chef client has agentless built into it. So if you had like a normal server that was running a normal system managed by Chef Infra and you wanted that to reach out to a remote system, you could. Generally, we advise against it just to kind of segment it out for troubleshooting, but technology-wise, that should work. Very similar, if you had Chef client installed on your Automate server, you could do that. You could have that client reach out. By default, Automate shouldn't have Chef client installed, so you'd have to like manually add it to it. But you could. And again, like in my environment, I've got Chef Workstation installed, so you guys are probably familiar with that, which is your local dev tools for cookbooks and things. I'm running it through the Chef client that's installed as part of that, but I could just throw Chef client on like a utility server or whatever, and run run it from there. So really, as long as it has network connectivity to that system, it doesn't matter kind of where it runs. And again, they can run on a schedule as well if you want to. But yeah, yes and no. Typically, I'd recommend against it, but scenarios differ, requirements differ, but technically it's possible. Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. Will this be able to configure ACI networks? It should, yeah. So it depends on, again, I hate to say like it depends, but as long as we can interface with that system, you absolutely can. So like for my Cisco appliances here, they're all running on iOS, or Cisco iOS, I should say. But you can access the switch via SSH. So so essentially what I'm doing is I'm SSHing, and then my recipe book or my recipes are running, translating my configurations into iOS and running those commands and doing that process, right? So with whatever vendor, whatever product that's managing those ACIs, you should be able to. But yeah, that would be the big requirement. And again, like I'm picking on like SSH, WinRM, but API as well. Essentially, as long as it has an interface we can talk to. So is this included in existing licenses or separate costs? Do target counts towards licensing nodes? Great question. So yeah, so it is licensed separate, but and I know it goes based on how many targets you're touching or talking to. But the specifics in terms of what the pricing is and all that, that would be a great question for your account manager or your account rep, because it differs. And I don't have the full exact numbers in front of me, unfortunately. But so it is, that is something I would definitely reach out to your account team if you're interested, or your account manager. And if you don't know who your account manager is, if you put your email in the survey, we can definitely hook you up with them and give you all the details on that. So what is TMT? So TMT is just the name of my cookbook. So that could be anything. So I could have named it Cisco. I could have named it networking. That's just the name of the cookbook. So in my case, I've got kind of a list of cookbooks that I've developed and I run on my systems, and TMT is just in that list. So, but that's where that comes from. But that name could be anything that you want. So how are we managing the desired state without Chef client on the remote switch? So again, yeah, that's going to be, we're SSHing into the switch, and then we are using we have some libraries and stuff built to run those Cisco iOS commands and talk to the switch, right? So the cool thing about that is, if I go back, or if I go back here, if I go back actually into my switch here. So normally if I wanted to change that banner, I'd have to go in, I got to go enable, comp T. Maybe I want to disable it, right? So I say no banner, message of the day. And now, I've changed it, but I haven't written it. So now I got to do write memory. And now it's actually deployed. So normally if I were to change that, I'm running all those commands and then I got to remember to save them, save it to memory so it's the active config. The cool thing about the cookbooks and the resources that we built that talk to Cisco is I don't have to do any of that. So all I got to do is say, hey, I want to change the message of the day. Here's what I want my text to be, and it's going to run those commands and the save command and all that for you. So that's kind of how that works there. And on the flip side of that, we can actually grab the values from the saved, from the running config, and we can see what the current values are. So when I actually go through and run it, that's what we're doing is we're grabbing the running config behind the scenes. We're checking what the value is, comparing it to this. And then if it needs a change, we run the command to change it, save it to memory, and then, you're good. So that's kind of how that manages there. So do you have a demo for Cisco firewalls? Not on hand. So right now I just have the switch, but that is something we are kind of looking towards. And we're having a lot of talks internally as well as with customers about automating firewall rule lists and and specifically with like incidents and things like that, right? So if I see like a DDoS coming through, being able to really quickly deploy a list of IPs to to block and not allow through, very quickly. So don't have a demo on that, but that is that is something definitely on the radar. Can we see what the resource code looks like? Yeah, absolutely. So let me go into the cookbook here. So just like any cookbook, you will have your resources folder here. So if you're doing any custom stuff, you can have that there. But yeah, this is all that logic, right? So this is and like I said, it's literally taking iOS commands and running them through that switch. So and changing it out. Now, I didn't talk about this kind of in the demo part, but this is something you can do. So for those who might not know, resources are kind of like the worker bees of the automation in terms of Chef. So resources will interact with systems in a specific way or do specific actions. And then your recipes will call those resources and feed them information to configure things. So like in this case, I've got a message of the day resource, so managing that message of the day on a switch or a Cisco device. This is all the logic of how to actually achieve that. And then my recipe, all I gotta do is say, hey, change the message of the day and here's the text. And it gives it to the resource to do all the work. But the cool thing about those resources is you can have multiple actions in them. So in this case, I've just got one that's setting it, right? Like I don't, I just want to change it. I want to update it, what have you. I can have a separate action. In this case, I've got it commented out, but like unset, right? So maybe I want to change, like revert something back. Or like in that firewall instance we're talking about, like maybe I add a range, I add a subnet or a range of IPs to be blacklisted, and I want to really quickly be able to undo that blacklist. You can have multiple actions, and then in my recipe, if I go back here, all I would do would be, I do something like action unset, and so you could do that for like maintenance windows or network shifts or things like that. But yeah, so that's a really kind of an easy or easy side of it. But yeah, again, it's just we're connecting, we're translating those, and sending them in. So, and this is actually where we make that connection in. So and and performing those actions. Are we recording this session? Yes, we are, and I believe it'll be available. It'll be available for rewatching and all that. And again, I just want to iterate. Today we're talking about Cisco devices, just because that's when we talk to customers and and we talk about unmanaged devices, that network appliances and like firewalls, IDS, IPS, those are kind of the biggest hitters. I'd say almost every conversation we have about it, those are the things that are getting requested. But this same framework, the same techniques can also apply to other systems as well. Like I called out like IP telephony or vendor servers, things like that. So you can, this can be extended out that way as well. And you can run, those inspect checks, and maybe you don't want to configure a system, but you want to inspect it and see like, hey, is this, in my case, maybe this one, I might have it say, hey, I don't want to touch the switch. I don't want to configure it. I still want that manual. But maybe I want to know like, hey, is my gigabit, my gigabit 10 port, is that enabled and configured, to be actually true gigabit, or is it 100 megabit or something else? I can, use the same approach and run just inspect on it, or both. But yeah, so that this recording should be out there after shortly after, and ready for review. Perfect. Any other questions before we wrap up today? Okay. So yeah, we got one DNS. What about DNS info blocks? Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with that as I should be, but again, if it has a way to talk to it, that should be completely doable. I know like other I've had some conversations with customers around managing like DNS zones and like reconfiguring DNS zones across organizations, basically consolidating DNS zones. And this, we've been in talks with that, and this would be something that could play into that, right? Of migrating those one by one, adding in like possible health check to make sure like, hey, my systems are pointing to that new, the new zone in the new DNS record, and then if that's good, then decommission the old one. So, but so yep, that would be yeah, as long as like again, as long as I can talk to it, should be good. So yeah, good question. Why not Ansible instead of Chef? So this is all built into Chef. So it's all really self-contained, right? So if you are already using Chef, this is a great extension on top of that, and just to extend your coverage and everything like that. In terms of if you're new to it, really the few main benefits for Chef are one is when we talk about compliance and inspect, all of our compliance profiles are built by us and managed by us, and not by a third party. So for example, maybe I've got like network appliances and I want to run like standard benchmarks against them, like CIS or STIG or DISA. What we do is we build out the profiles, send them out to be certified, and then when they get approved and blessed, we publish them and give them to you and ready to go. So that's kind of the big one there. And then second is really just the full flexibility and customization you have around it. So The scenario I showed today was very, the goal is to be very simple and kind of transparent with it because we're going through kind of a new concept, right? But this is infinitely customizable, right? So I could add, if I want to add control logic, if I want to add attributes and things like that, you can really quickly manage that and do that. And this is all self-contained as well. So for example, I don't need a Chef Automate server or a Chef Infra server to run target mode like this. It can run, it can run independent. Like there's no necessarily a control server or anything that has to happen there. So, not dissing Ansible in any way, but just a different approach, different kind of way to look at it. And we kind of highlighted over it, but we take more of a policy approach to things. So, for example, if you're using policy-based management in Chef, you're going to, when we create the automations and stuff, we're going to cryptographically version lock it, and that goes through the whole process, right? So, for example, say I create this automation, right, for for my network devices, right? I really want to make sure that that code is not changed between me writing it and it getting deployed to that switch, right? Because if I'm a bad actor and if I intercept that and change it to do something that you weren't planning, that's not good. So with the policy approach that Chef uses, I create the automation. I say, yep, this is my deployable unit. We cryptographically sign every cookbook that falls in that policy and the policy as a whole. And that gets checked not only at creation, but also when we deploy it to a system. And if it fails, we don't run that. So again, more secure, and with integrations with like password vaults and things like that, overall just a much more secure system. So perfect. Yep. So we have, yep, if you apply compliance profiles, will they show on Automate dashboard? Yes. So in my case, I have this completely standalone, but the agents have a configuration setting called reporter, and that can send the result of all this up into Automate. So for those who aren't maybe familiar, who might not be running it, Automate is like our web reporting UI report type server. So it gives you a really good overview of your entire environment and what the status of everything is. So if I'm managing 100 servers and like a whole bunch of switches and routers, that could be very cumbersome to go through. So Automate, what it does is it collects all the results data from that and shows you really quickly everything that's in the pass state, everything in the fail state, and what the status of everything is. So in my environment, I'm running it completely standalone, but that reporter setting is just a single line that you could add on to either in the cookbook or on the on that system, and just have the results sent straight to Automate. So, and when it does reporting to Automate, it'll show the node name for it. You can customize what that node name is, right? So normally like the node name will be like the host name if you're running a local agent. But in my case, I could pull like the host name with a switch. So, in my case, mine was named training switch, but I could grab that, or we can add a, have it report under a custom name as well. So, yep. So does policy mean environments.json? No. So you've got kind of two main systems of managing like the automations and stuff in Chef. Roles and environments were kind of the older method, and they're still good. There's still cases for that. But policies and policy files are kind of what replaced it, and we're kind of is a newer version of that. And essentially, both of them are what we use to say, hey, I want to run these sets of automations on these systems. They just achieve it in a different way. That policy files is the one, that's the system that adds like the cryptographic checks and things like that. Yep. Yep. And Paul, okay, I got you. Yep. So so the environment.json where we lock the cookbook version. Yep. Policy files has that exact same functionality. It's just it's in a different file. It's in a different spot. So for example, if I don't know if this one's fully filled out. Yeah. So this would be the I have a policy file here, which is just, again, a grouping of cookbooks I want to run. I'm not using it for today's demo, but here I could say, I can say what that particular version is, and lock it down to a particular version. So, and that'll grab it from this metadata here. So, but yeah. Good question. Can you use Courier in the same way? Absolutely, you can. And so for those who don't know, Chef Courier is a new feature. It's currently in beta, but it will be coming GA soon. So keep an eye out for it. But essentially what Courier allows you to do is job orchestration. And so it's a little bit more kind of broad and open-ended. So you can have it do a series of steps. You can have condition logic. So you can say, hey, I want to check this thing. And if it's set this way, do this, otherwise do that. It has a lot of functionality around like managing, if you want to run like a script or you want to run a job across 10 different systems. It has a lot of control of like, hey, run it on these two systems at a time. When that's done, go to the next two, the next two, the next two. So very similar. The primary difference is going to be Courier is agent-based. So there is a Courier agent, but it could be used in a very similar method as well. Yeah. The scenario just, if you want to use agentless or you want to use Courier, it just depends kind of what you're trying to achieve, what you've already got configured and set up, and then, from there. But yeah, there's definitely overlap in terms of what the outcomes could be between Courier and agentless. What is the best way to learn Chef? So yeah, there are a lot of good ways. So I will say probably the best, if you ever have any questions, I would go to docs.chef.io. So if you have a question, anything you could want or find, or need in terms of setting things up, what options you have available, oopsies, is there. The other option, I try to pull it up here, is Learn Chef. So Chef, or I guess if you do learn.chef.io, but here's the full URL, it goes to the same spot. So there's really cool e-courses that you can do here, all kind of, from beginner all the way on, right? So, for example, we've got this beginning the journey, which is kind of the high overview of what Chef is, what it does, how it works. We talked about agent-based chef, or kind of the normal type chef. That's going to be more of like this class here. And then, a whole bunch of different classes around that. So I would use both. Some great resources across both. Perfect. Cool. Well, yeah, I think that's all the questions we've had today. So, absolutely. If you have any more questions after the fact, definitely feel free to either reach out to your account team or You can even put some information on that on the survey that comes through of, hey, you know, I might have some questions. Can someone reach out and just, you know, make introductions? But yeah, no, that's again, that survey is very handy. It helps us kind of tailor not only the you know, presentation styles and things like that, but like what topics we cover and like what's of interest to you and what's going to be the most valuable for your automation journey. So if you could please fill that out when it pops up, that would be awesome. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending, and hope this was valuable, and have a great rest of your day.